And that's what I want to talk to you about. The title of this talk is Leadership in the Hurricane of Change. And the winds of change have always blown for fish and wildlife professionals. The winds of change have always blown, and things have always been changing, and change is always hard. But the winds of change now have accelerated to a hurricane. And most fish and wildlife professionals in this country operate in large agencies, either state or federal agencies, and they're so scared they can hardly even see straight. Because most fish and wildlife agencies in this country, the people who do the mainline conservation work in this country, most of those agencies are slowly strangling. As the expectations go through the roof for not only doing traditional hunting and fishing management, but looking out for endangered species and trying to educate people about the ecology and trying to manage development in some way. It's like trying to hold back a glacier that's just grinding things to powder, slowly but surely. And at the same time, they're largely all funded by hunting and fishing fees with a shrinking demographic of hunting and fishing. And we can't get from here to there, and every time they point out, well, we really need some general fund, general tax dollars that get out of our hair. Are you kidding me? Forget it. We can't afford you guys anymore. We're busy fighting wars and giving tax breaks and dealing with the huge federal budget shortfalls and the deficit. And quit squawking about this hunting and fishing stuff, this wildlife conservation. We have real issues in this country, and every one of them are scared to death. And whether it's the tightened funding base, or whether it's the swing of policy perspective in this country that has shifted so much since the 60s, not in the 70s. When I came out of school in 1969, we were in the middle of the Vietnam War, and we were in the heart of the environmental revolution, and we were setting new standards for policy in this country about conservation. And the success story that you saw on this wall about eagles happened because we faced up to the crisis of DDT. And that was no small battle. That was a big deal. There were people who said agriculture is going to collapse without DDT. There were people who said we'll be overcome by mosquitoes and all die of disease because we need DDT. They used to sprinkle DDT in the rucksacks of the World War II soldiers because they felt like they couldn't fight the war unless we kept wildlife at bay, little wildlife. And yet, with Rachel Carson telling the story and 1,000 voices joining in chorus and then 1,000,000 voices joining in chorus, we turned that corner and we established a regulatory baseline in this country designed to allow us to have our culture and have our society and still live in some harmony with nature. And the story of the Silent Spring inspired a whole generation of us to go into this work, and inspired a whole generation of us to want to work in fish and wildlife policy, and inspired a whole generation of us to want to take our science understanding and translate it into the inevitable so what question, and jump right in the middle of these very, very difficult policy debates of the time. And the result was we built that regulatory baseline, we banned DDT, and the result 40 years later as we look at this magnificent conservation victory that would have never happened. Now ask yourself today, in the context of the debates of today, if we would have the backbone to establish a ban on DDT. Would we have the political strength in this country today to fight that battle and win it and pass that ban? And many people, I see a few people shaking their head in this room right now. The reality is this is a different time. This is a more difficult time. This is a tougher time. And what we're really talking about, in my opinion, right now, going on in this country, is the greatest threat to our fundamental core conservation framework in this country in 100 years. So as I talk about 100 years ago, I want to talk to you about my new favorite book. How many of you have read or even heard about this book? It's called The Big Burn by author Timothy Egan. It is required reading for every conservationist and every wildlife lover in this country. And when I'm invited to speak, I speak about nothing else but this story that I'm sharing with you right now. And I want to tell you why I'm recommending a book that's so important. I compare it only to Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac as the Bible for all fish and wildlife conservationists in this country. The subtitle is Teddy Roosevelt and the Fire That Saved America. You know, 100 years ago, Teddy Roosevelt was just finishing up his second term of his presidency. And he and Gifford Pinchot and John Burroughs and John Muir, and George Bird Evans and a few other crazy people, most of whom were hunters and bird watchers, had this crazy idea that we could do something other than simply document the decline of wildlife across America and around the world. It's not inevitable that the bison have to go extinct. It's not inevitable that the elk have to go extinct. We right now are up to our ears in white-tailed deer here in Virginia. In those days, it was a rarity to see one. In those days, we were marching toward mass extinction of wildlife in this country. And they had this crazy idea that we can do something different. We can manage wildlife for the people rather than manage wildlife as yet another crop for the rich landowner like they do in Europe. And by happenstance, McKinley got killed and Roosevelt became president and decided he was going to just start doing it. And of course all the corrupt politicians and the political magnates and the giant corporations and the hyper-rich moguls all decided, oh no, that's not the way we're going to do this, that's not what we think the role of government is, and he rolled right over the top of them in his 2 terms as president by essentially appealing to the people and talking about the democratic notion that wildlife is a public asset. Wildlife belongs to all the people. Wildlife belongs to our children, and we're going to preserve them. And he created 191 million acres of federal forests. And he created a cadre of scientifically trained experts to manage those federal forests. And guys like Weyerhaeuser, who were rapidly privatizing the forests through land fraud, artificially and inappropriately and illegally using the Homestead Act, hiring people to go out and declare homestead on 160 acres of timber and 2 years later selling it to Weyerhaeuser for a nickel. I mean, that kind of stuff was going on and they had a fit. And Roosevelt defeated them all and set up the National Wildlife Refuges. He set up the national parks. He began forming a cadre of scientifically trained people to manage the public's asset for the public in a way that's uniquely American and unlike anything that has ever been done since and unlike anything else that's ever been done anywhere in the world to this day. That is the conservation framework that Roosevelt built by 1910. Now think about the political debates we have today about public versus private, prioritization of money, the establishment of a regulatory baseline to protect environmental values as we grow and develop. And think about what he must have been up against in 1910. And as he was wrapping up his second term, this whole story is told in this book, he was heading off to Africa for a safari, and he turned over the presidency to his hand-picked successor, his Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, who carried on for the Republican Party. Roosevelt was a Republican, under the promise that Taft would build upon and protect this conservation framework. And Roosevelt went cruising off to Africa, and Taft sold him out. Taft sold him out to the business interests. Taft sold him out to the corrupt politicians. Taft began dismantling the U.S. Forest Service. We can't afford this. This is too expensive. Business will take care of our forests. Roosevelt came back and declared holy war. And he began taking them on one at a time. And he began what became the famous Roosevelt Whistle Stop Tour of the 1911. And he went from town to town to town, speaking in the back of a train to thousands of people. Think about how many people were in America in 1911. Thousands of people would gather, and millions more would learn of his story through the media. And he said, we're losing a unique vision for managing the public's interest. But Roosevelt was losing that argument, and then something extraordinary happened in 1912.
Hi, I'm Jim Martin. I'm presenting at the Eagle Conference in Norfolk, and I give Christina permission to post any and everything I say, and I hope the whole dang world looks at it.